When a president threatens tariffs on fertilizer, it might sound like just another chapter in an unending trade conflict, another news bite, another promise to be tough. But if you look just beneath the surface of this particular threat, to slap severe tariffs on Canadian potash, the vital nutrient that quite literally feeds North American fields, you discover something far more concerning. You find an economy quietly sawing at the branch it is sitting on. You find a policy that looks strong on television but is dangerously weak when you trace who actually pays the bill. And whether you work in farming, food processing, rural services, or you simply buy groceries every week, you are far closer to that bill than you might realize. Let me start with the basic storyline. The United States imports a large share of the potash it uses as fertilizer. A huge portion of that comes from Canada, especially from the province of Saskatchewan, which holds some of the richest potash deposits in the world. Potash is not a luxury item. It is one of the core nutrients that makes modern yields of corn, soybeans, wheat, and many other crops possible. Without it, fields do not just produce a little less. Over time, they become exhausted. So when a president says he is ready to put very severe tariffs on fertilizer imports and points specifically to Canada, he is not poking a minor supplier. He is threatening the main artery of the American fertilizer system and with it the entire cost structure of American agriculture. Now, if you are listening to this and you are a farmer, you do not need me to explain what happens when input costs spike. Fertilizer is not a side item on your budget. It can be one of the single largest costs in a growing season. A jump of even a modest amount per ton, once you scale it over hundreds or thousands of acres, eats straight into your margins. Many farms today are already surviving on thin lines of credit and volatile commodity prices. A policy that deliberately raises the price of a crucial input is not a casual experiment. It is a direct hit on your livelihood. And here is the twist that almost never gets mentioned in the speeches. The Canadian companies exporting potash to the United States have other buyers waiting. Emerging economies in Asia, major agricultural producers in Latin America, and markets across Europe are all looking for stable fertilizer supply. If you make potash more expensive for American buyers through tariffs, Canada does not collapse. It diversifies. To understand why this is so lopsided, you have to think in terms of geology and infrastructure rather than slogans. The United States cannot simply decide to become a major potash producer next year because it wishes it. Mineral deposits are not created by press conference. Building a new mine, even if you have the resource, takes years of exploration, investment, infrastructure, and regulation. Canada spent decades treating potash as a strategic asset. It built rail lines, ports, pipelines, regulatory frameworks, and long-term contracts to anchor this sector. As a result, it sits today as the most reliable major supplier at a moment when other exporters like Russia and Belarus are constrained by sanctions and geopolitical tensions. The United States, on the other hand, made a different set of choices. It allowed itself to become structurally dependent on imported fertilizer while telling farmers that markets would deliver whatever they needed at the right price. This is where the trade conflict language becomes so misleading. Tariffs are sold as tools to punish them and protect you. But when the thing you are taxing is a key input your own producers cannot replace, the line between them and you breaks down. A tariff on potash imported from Canada does not primarily land on Canadian balance sheets. It lands on the invoices sent to American farmers. It shows up in the bids they make for next season, in the interest rates their banks quote them, in the prices they need to charge just to break even. You might hear big numbers in Washington about new revenue that tariffs bring in, but each dollar of tariff revenue began as a higher cost somewhere in the real economy. In this case, very often in a rural community that has already been told to tighten its belt through every crisis of the last decade. You might be thinking, is there at least some strategic benefit here? Some long-term gain in exchange for the short-term pain? The rhetoric suggests that by making imported fertilizer more expensive, the United States will somehow reshore production, encourage domestic mining, and become more self-reliant. That story would make sense if the bottleneck were laziness or a lack of patriotic commitment among domestic producers. It makes no sense when the bottleneck is geology and decades of infrastructure that you cannot rebuild overnight. The risk is that you end up with the worst of both worlds. You do not suddenly create a thriving domestic potash industry, but you do create a cost shock for your agricultural sector, and then spend public money trying to patch the damage through ad hoc support programs and bailouts. We have already seen a version of this movie, but when tariffs were imposed on a range of imports during earlier phases of the trade conflict, American farmers lost access to some of their key export markets, especially for soybeans. The government then turned around and announced billions in relief payments to compensate for the damage its own policy had helped cause. That money did not come from nowhere. It came from taxpayers and from future public budgets that could have been used for rural infrastructure, climate resilience, education, or health care. Now, we are flirting with a new round of the same dynamic, but this time targeting the inputs that make the harvest possible in the first place. If you care about fiscal responsibility, this should trouble you. If you care about food prices, it should worry you even more. There is another layer here that I want you to see because it goes beyond one tariff fight. On the other side of the border, Canadian policymakers are reading the same headlines and drawing their own conclusions. Faced with an unpredictable partner that uses tariffs as a routine bargaining tool, they are doubling down on diversification. They are signing new trade agreements in Asia, deepening ties with Europe, and promoting themselves as a dependable supplier of critical minerals and agricultural inputs. In other words, they are doing for their economy what the United States claims to want to do for its own, but they are doing it through stability and openness rather than through threats. When you step back, you realize that a tariff on potash does not make North America stronger. It nudges Canada further toward a world where it is less reliant on the United States while leaving American farmers more exposed and more isolated. If you zoom out from fertilizer and look at the broader pattern, the same contradictions appear in America's wider relationship with Canada and the world. On one side, you have a White House that treats tariffs, defense systems, and sound bites about the 51st state as instruments of dominance. On the other, you have a Canadian government that has quietly decided it will no longer bet its prosperity on the moods of Washington. That contrast came into sharp focus when Prime Minister Mark Carney stood on the Apex stage and announced a forthcoming visit to China. To many viewers, it was just another diplomatic headline. To anyone who follows global economics, it was a signal that Canada is repositioning itself as an independent strategic middle power rather than a permanent junior partner. The logic behind Carney's move is straightforward. Canada has paid a high price for being caught in the crossfire of great power disputes. When tensions with China escalated in the late 2010s and early 2020s, Canadian farmers lost billions in export sales. Energy projects were delayed, trust evaporated. Re-engaging Beijing is not about naivety. It is about diversification. China is a market of 1.4 billion people with deep needs in food, clean technology, and advanced fuels, precisely the areas where Canada has comparative strengths. By normalizing relations and rebuilding certification systems and business channels, Ottawa is not choosing China over the United States. It is choosing not to be hostage to any single market. The timing amplifies the message. Just as Washington cobbles together a one-year tariff truce with Beijing, reducing average tariffs slightly while leaving the underlying confrontation unresolved, Canada steps in with a longer-term vision. While Washington performs crisis management, Ottawa works on architecture, trade agreements with Europe and the UK, new pacts in Southeast Asia, and a deeper role in the Indo-Pacific economy that now drives the majority of global growth. That is not disloyalty. It is what any rational country does when an ally repeatedly uses economic coercion and public humiliation as negotiating tools. If you make your partners feel like supplicants, do not be surprised when they start building exits. This rebalancing is even more striking when you look back at the Trump-Carney meetings in Washington. In front of the cameras, there were warm words about friendship and trade. Behind them was a simple fact. Tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, lumber, furniture, and other goods were driving up costs in American factories, construction projects, and households. Canadian producers suffered, but they adapted. Some shifted exports toward Europe and Asia. Ottawa provided targeted support. By contrast, the United States found its own manufacturers squeezed by higher input prices and its own consumers paying more at the checkout. When the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Great Lakes governors publicly begged for de-escalation, they were effectively admitting what the administration would not. A tariff on Canada is in practice a tax on Americans. Canada's response was not to shout louder, but to lean on the quiet power of integration. Canadian capital is one of the largest sources of foreign investment in the United States. Canadian electricity keeps lights on in U.S. cities and factories. Canadian materials are embedded in American cars, aircraft, buildings, and grids. That deep interdependence is not a weakness, it is a form of leverage. When a U.S. president half-jokingly tells Canada it can have missile defense for free if it becomes the 51st state, he reveals his own mental map, a world where power flows in one direction from Washington outward. But the real world is one where severing or even fraying cross-border links comes at an enormous cost to both sides, and increasingly to the United States itself. This is why the rhetoric of national greatness and the reality of policy outcomes diverge so sharply. Tariffs on lumber and furniture meant to revive American industry instead raised the price of building homes and furnishing them. Aggressive posturing over defense systems and territorial jokes stirred applause at rallies, but signaled to allies that American guarantees came with a permanent threat of economic punishment. Meanwhile, Canada invested in critical minerals, new refining capacity, clean energy projects, and digital-era trade agreements. The more Washington behaved like an unpredictable landlord, the more Ottawa behaved like a homeowner, quietly paying down debt, renovating, and adding extra doors to the house. From the perspective of economic welfare, especially in rural and working-class communities, this path is dangerous. Tariffs on potash, on lumber, on manufactured goods do not occur in isolation. They stack. Each one adds a few dollars here, a percentage point there, until farmers, builders, small manufacturers, and low-income consumers are all carrying the cumulative burden. The same administration that promises to stand with forgotten communities ends up taxing their inputs, destabilizing their export markets, and then offering temporary relief checks when the damage becomes politically unbearable. That is not a strategy. It is a recurring pattern of self-inflicted crisis and partial compensation. There is an alternative. You can treat allies like genuine partners, not props or targets. You can recognize that in a world of climate change, geopolitical fragmentation, and fragile supply chains, reliability is itself a strategic asset. Canada has understood this and is trying to build a reputation as the dependable supplier of fertilizer, energy, food, and critical minerals. The United States could choose to anchor a North American growth strategy around that reliability, coordinating on clean agriculture, shared infrastructure, and resilient industrial supply chains. Instead, too often it chooses to weaponize interdependence for short-term political theater. In the end, the question is not whether tariffs sound tough or polls move for a news cycle. The question is who ends up more secure, more prosperous, and more influential 10 years from now. A country that taxes its own farmers' fertilizer, its own factories' inputs, and its own consumers' furniture in the name of punishing its closest neighbor is not acting from strength. It is acting from confusion. A country that takes those shocks and uses them to diversify, build new partnerships, and deepen its credibility is playing a longer, smarter game. On potash, on trade with Asia, on critical minerals, the pattern is the same. The louder Washington shouts, the more carefully Ottawa plans. And in a world where stability and trust are increasingly scarce, it is often the quiet strategist, not the loudest voice, who ends up shaping the future. If you want to understand how this moment fits into the broader trajectory of North American politics, look closely at what is happening inside the United States as these tariff battles drag on. The more Washington leans on threats, the more it exposes a deeper vulnerability. The assumption that America can act unilaterally without meaningful consequences at home. That belief might have worked decades ago when the U.S. economy was less dependent on global supply chains and when allies had fewer options. It does not work in a world where production networks, energy grids, and investment flows are tightly woven across borders. The United States can still issue commands, but it cannot command outcomes. Tariffs on lumber, furniture, steel, aluminum, and now the potential strike against Canadian potash were originally framed as tools to revive American manufacturing and strengthen national security. But as time passed, a different pattern emerged. These policies hit American households, American contractors, American farmers, and American small businesses long before they touched the structural competitiveness of any foreign industry. That gap between intention and impact has quietly reshaped the political map. Rural counties that once formed the core of electoral strength now carry the weight of higher fertilizer prices, disrupted export markets, and volatile input costs. Industrial states struggle with more expensive materials, forcing factories to delay hiring or reduce shifts. And suburban families already stretched by housing, groceries, and childcare are paying more because tariffs ripple through every stage of the supply chain. Meanwhile, Canada has taken those same shocks and turned them into catalysts. Each tariff becomes another justification for diversification. Each diplomatic slight becomes another reason to deepen ties in Asia and Europe. Each threat accelerates the shift toward Canadian-controlled supply chains in critical minerals, energy storage, agricultural inputs, and green manufacturing. This is not defiance. It is adaptation, and it is increasingly effective. While Washington tries to pull its partners into narrower, more transactional relationships, Ottawa is building the next layer of its global identity, a country small enough to remain flexible but large and stable enough to matter. To some observers, the boldest statements, like the suggestion that Canada could join the U.S. as the 51st state in exchange for access to America's missile defense system, might sound like political showmanship. But the underlying message lands very differently for Canadians. It reinforces a perception that Washington no longer sees Canada as an equal partner, but as a territory whose loyalty must be tested and whose autonomy can be bargained away. Far from intimidating Canada, this rhetoric accelerates the very outcome not wanted: a more independent Canadian foreign policy that looks less like an extension of U.S. strategy and more like a confident middle power charting its own course. Inside Canada, this shift has produced something unusual: unity. Business leaders, provincial premiers, and even opposition politicians who normally disagree on nearly everything have rallied around the need to protect Canada's economic sovereignty. The reason is simple. They all see what the data shows. Canada's integration with the U.S. economy runs so deep that defending national interests requires calm, disciplined, long-term thinking, not reactive nationalism. Mark Carney embodies that approach. He does not match energy with counter-theatrics. He does not escalate with louder threats. Instead, he plays the slow game, strengthening supply chains, reinforcing alliances, courting foreign investment, and presenting Canada as the dependable partner in an unpredictable world. Step back, and the contrast could not be sharper. One speaks of dominance. The other speaks of resilience. One measures victory in headlines. The other measures it in stability. One seeks leverage through disruption, the other finds it in integration. And that distinction matters because global power is increasingly defined not by the ability to shock markets, but by the ability to reassure them. Investors flee volatility. Multinationals choose predictable jurisdictions. Food security planners prioritize reliable suppliers. In each of these arenas, Canada gains stature every time the U.S. uses tariffs as a megaphone. The missile defense announcement is a perfect illustration of the moment. The United States wanted to showcase military supremacy and succeeded. But the real story happened in the margins. Canada expressed interest because defense integration with the U.S. has been a pillar of security for decades. Yet rather than deepening that cooperation, the inquiry was turned into a bargaining chip wrapped in a joke about annexation. What should have been an opportunity to strengthen trust instead became another reminder that Washington's commitments are conditional, transactional, and tied to political spectacle. And so, North America moves forward with two very different philosophies of leadership. One is loud, improvisational, driven by pressure tactics and short-term gains. The other is quiet, methodical, driven by diversification and long-term insurance. You do not need to be an economist to see which one is creating openings and which one is creating risks. As the next chapters unfold, whether on fertilizer, minerals, energy, or trade with Asia, the center of gravity in the relationship is shifting, not dramatically, not explosively, but steadily. And that is the irony. Tariffs meant to assert American strength are instead accelerating the emergence of a more autonomous Canada, one less dependent on Washington and more engaged with the world. A policy designed to tighten control is nudging the neighbor toward independence. A trade war launched to force concessions is teaching Canada exactly how to thrive without them. It is a transformation unfolding in real time. And whether policymakers in Washington acknowledge it or not, it will shape the future of North American politics, long after the tariff headlines fade. In the end, this entire dispute reveals something larger than fertilizer, tariffs, or diplomatic theater. It shows two countries moving in different directions, one grasping for leverage through confrontation, the other gaining leverage through steadiness. If the United States chooses to tax the very inputs its farmers rely on, the consequences will fall not on foreign rivals, but on its own rural heartland. And if Canada continues responding with patience, diversification, and strategic calm, it will keep strengthening the very independence Washington never intended to encourage. The truth is simple. Trade conflicts do not rewrite geology, they do not rebuild supply chains, and they do not bend allies into submission. They only expose who has prepared for the future and who is still shouting at the past. As this chapter closes, the lesson is unmistakable. Power built on disruption fades quickly, but power built on stability lasts.